A helicopter brings a quiet medic to a mountain base, and by nightfall, everyone thinks they have already measured her. Then the valley erupts, the ridges light up, and one wounded woman starts speaking through the radio with a calm that keeps 477 men alive. What no one knows yet is that the medic patching bodies in the dark can also end a battlefield from 900 meters away.
The static hissed, died, and then her voice emerged, possessing a tranquility that had no place in that godforsaken valley. Hellfire rained down from two separate ridgelines, and the night was shredded by the sound of metal tearing through men. Her tone cut through the pandemonium, a steady presence that reached 480 soldiers and delivered something no drill instructor ever could. "Alpha, fall back west, 150 meters, she said. "Use that wash to your left. Go." Commander Nate Harwick flattened himself against a massive boulder, listening to her. 30 years in the field told him this situation was outside any tactical model he'd ever known. He had 480 operators trapped here, the service's sharpest, most seasoned men. They were deployed to a jagged mountain range in a country they'd been fighting in for 2 decades. On what the intel jocks had promised was a milk run. The intelligence was garbage. The incoming fire from the east wasn't some ragtag ambush. It was a symphony of death, perfectly timed and layered by an enemy who knew they were coming. The western ridge answered with its own barrage. The valley floor, a clean approach on satellite imagery for the last 2 weeks, had become a kill box in 90 seconds flat. Fiery tracers zipped through the darkness over his head. To his left, a man's shriek echoed the sound of a body broken in a way the mind couldn't yet process. To his right, 2 others fell silent, a stillness more final than any scream. He keyed his mic. "Doc, medics are inbound. What's your 20? 4 seconds passed. 5. An eternity. "I'm occupied, Commander," she replied. "Worry about the north corridor. They're setting up a mortar pit about 200 meters east of you. Move your casualties before they dial it in." He started to argue. Her voice sliced through his authority, calm and absolute with the God's eye view he lacked. "Move the wounded, sir. I'll be here. Get them clear." Harwick froze, staring at the handset. In 30 years and dozens of firefights, no one had ever spoken to him like that over the radio. Not with that tone. It wasn't an absence of fear, but something forged beyond it. A resolve born from knowledge and commitment he'd rarely witnessed in 3 decades. He made the call, he complied. Long after, men who'd bled in Fallujah and Kandahar would struggle to describe that night, saying the words fell short. They'd never heard a voice like that on the comms, not in all their years. They said it reached into the chaos and anchored your soul when the world was coming apart. She held the radio, prone behind a rock on the northern slope, a fresh bullet wound in her shoulder that she'd packed herself, one-handed, with practiced efficiency. Blood soaked through the dressing and her jacket, bringing the icy chill of exsanguination. But her mind was a razor, and her right hand was rock steady. She kept talking. 477 men lived to see the next dawn because of her actions. But this isn't about the fight. It's about the 18 hours that preceded it. A morning that started with a chopper, a duffel bag, and a room of hardened professionals who thought they knew exactly what they were looking at. They were wrong on almost every count. The forward operating base was perched at 6,000 feet, a place that existed only on tactical overlays. It had a generator, 3 connected prefab huts, a med tent, a comms array, and a perimeter that had been hardened twice in the last week. The men who built it understood that adding layers wasn't defeatist, it was just smart. The mountains walled them in on 3 sides, with the 4th opening to the valley. The thin air held a bone-deep cold that seeped past any gear, a constant presence the men learned to ignore. You learn to work through what you can't change. The cold was one of those things. The day's last chopper arrived at 1700 hours, flying nap of the earth along the ridge. Its prop wash flattened everything in its path as it touched down. The crew chief shoved out 2 fuel cells and a pallet of medical gear. A single figure followed. The helo was lifting off before she'd even cleared the landing pad. The rotor wash slammed into her, but she caught her hair with one hand, never breaking stride, showing no newcomer's hesitation. Her path was already plotted. She'd memorized the base layout 3 days ago while reviewing the mission intel. She'd also memorized something else from that file, a detail she'd kept to herself. She had spotted an anomaly, the very reason she'd volunteered for this assignment. She held that intel close, a hidden blade. The duffel on her shoulder was standard issue. The Pelican case in her hand was for medical supplies. She wore gray cargo pants and a fleece, moving with the economy of a woman on a mission, with nothing to prove. Petty Officer First Class Colt Briggs stood at the pad's edge, tablet in hand, as she passed within 8 feet of him. He was 6'2" and 220 pounds of Delta-trained muscle, forged over 12 years. He sized her up with the swift, unforgiving calculus he applied to everything in his world. He turned to the operator next to him and spoke his mind. The damn gear outweighs her. His buddy started to reply, saw Briggs's face, and thought better of it. The assessment wasn't far off. She was 5'4", maybe 118 pounds, soaking wet. Her hair was tied back with zero fuss. The gate sentry had double-checked her contractor ID before letting her pass. Her eyes were dark, constantly scanning the focused sweep of a recon drone, not a casual glance. But Briggs wasn't looking that closely. His judgment was made. His mind was already onto logistics and timelines and the dozen other items on his checklist before 2100. Her name was Tessa Cole. The roster listed her as a Navy corpsman and civilian contractor, requested by Naval Special Warfare Command to fill a last-minute vacancy. Her file was impeccable. Johns Hopkins Medical, trauma certified. 2 previous deployments, non-combat support. Her service record noted 53 field interventions. All 53 patients had survived. That last detail had snagged Commander Harwick's attention. 53 for 53 under fire wasn't just skill, it was something else entirely. He located her in the med tent 40 minutes later. She'd already broken down the supply crates, organizing them by trauma class and medication. She was cross-referencing inventory against the mission plan on a notepad, with the quiet competence of a seasoned pro who had no time for an audience. Her gaze shifted as he entered, a simple retasking of focus. Commander Harwick, you've seen the op plan. Yes, sir. Questions? Her head canted slightly, the subtle motion of a mind sorting through a checklist. The projected Kia and WIA is based on pre-2021 data. With current atmospherics and the elevation drop from the LZ, I'd bump that number 20%. He watched her. It's a logistics issue, she clarified. If the main aid station goes down in the first hour, which the terrain makes likely, I'll need medkits pre-staged at 3 rally points. I can handle it tonight. Harwick paused. He'd been ready for the standard contractor checklist comms, CASEVAC plans, the usual routine concerns. He hadn't expected a private risk assessment on his casualty figures. Set up what you need, he said. He stepped from the tent into the biting air, pausing for a beat. He filed it away in his head, in the storage locker, for things that might matter a great deal later on. Briggs broadcast his verdict 3 times before chow. First, during gear check, he announced her requested medkit was kitted out like a combat hospital. Second, at the brief, she sat in back, silent for 40 minutes, her focus on the topo map so intense, Briggs felt it more than saw it, like movement at the edge of his vision. The third time was at dinner. He told 3 other operators she was a liability in the field, stating it flatly, like a weather report. It wasn't cruel. In Briggs's world, liability was the most vital word there was. A liability was a variable that got your people killed. It was something you identified and zeroed out before the operation went live. He was protecting his men. He would have told you that, and he would have believed it, and he wouldn't have been entirely wrong. He didn't know she heard him through the canvas wall. She sat on the other side, finished her food, and stayed silent. Her father's lesson: deflection is efficiency. Save your words for when they're required. Everything else is just static, and engaging static drains your batteries for the real work. She'd been practicing that discipline for 16 years. She was excellent at it. Chief Petty Officer Vance Dunar found her by the perimeter wire at dusk. He was 53, with the dense build of a man who'd done hard work for 3 decades, and a stillness the younger men lacked. It was the quiet of a man who'd processed hell and come out the other side, carrying it all without slowing his pace. He'd barely spoken since her arrival, just watched her with an unreadable look. The look of a man confirming a theory. He found her on the eastern perimeter, watching the valley drown in shadow from the ground up. He stood beside her, watching the same view for a long, quiet moment. Your old man was Frank Cole? She held still for 2 deliberate beats. Yes, she confirmed. SEAL Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia. 3 tours in the sandbox. Retired 2012. She finally turned to him. Trained with him at Coronado in '95, Dunar said. I was 24, and I showed up positive I was God's gift, right before he showed me what God's gift actually looked like. A beat passed. Frank spent 45 minutes correcting that assumption, politely, which made it worse. He never mentioned you, she said. He rarely mentioned anyone by name. That was Frank, Dunar agreed. But he mentioned you. Not often. Ran into him a few years before he passed. He said his daughter had the eye. Said it was the rarest damned thing he'd seen in 40 years, and he was working to teach it its own weight. She was silent. He died in 2019. March 14th, cerebral hemorrhage. 57 years old, made it through all that, only to die in a San Diego hospital 3 days after a stroke came out of nowhere. She stated it without bitterness or any performed grief, just a list of facts she'd carried so long they'd become smooth. Dunar nodded slowly. I'm sorry for your loss, he said. Thank you. The valley was black now. Stars pricked the ridgeline as the generator behind them kicked on, the camp lights flickering once before holding steady. The way you studied that topo map today, Dunar said quietly. Your eyes went to the high ground, not the valley, during the Overwatch brief. He paused. That was pure Frank. She didn't reply. I'm not asking you a damn thing, he clarified. I'm just telling you what I saw. I know what it means. And whatever mission you're on, you're not doing it with this whole camp blind to what you are. He met her eyes. Someone needed to know. Now you know that I do. He walked back toward the compound without another word. She stood at the wire for a long time. Now, there's something you have to understand about Frank Cole. He was no celebrity. His name isn't in any book or official report from his 30 years of service. No documentaries, no interviews, no TV shows. His reputation existed where it counted in quiet conversations between men, the kind of unrecorded history that matters most. He enlisted at 18. He went through Bud S with a combination of raw endurance and mental quiet that the instructors at Coronado recognized but couldn't quite name. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest. He was the one who, when things got truly awful, would simply retreat inside himself to a place the pain couldn't reach and keep going. A place not everyone possessed. He earned his trident, became excellent, and then evolved into something more. A man who understood not just times how times to do the job, but times why, asterisk. And he knew the vast distance between the two. Desert Storm in 1991, Somalia in '93, the MOG, October of that year, a battle that became a shorthand for chaos. 3 tours in Afghanistan after the towers fell. Long-range Overwatch so deep in the shadows it was scrubbed from every after-action report, untouchable by any Freedom of Information Act request. In the language of his tribe, he became a ghost not by design, but by definition. He punched out in 2012, settled in San Diego. Ran at 0530 every morning, maintained his kit, and taught at a private facility that will remain nameless. When his daughter was 10, he put a rifle in her hands. Not to make her a copy of himself, he was adamant about that, and she understood. He did it because he believed that to truly understand a weapon, from physics to ballistics to the psychology of the decision, was to understand something fundamental about power and its consequences. He taught her for years, every weekend they could, and on summer mornings before the heat set in. Distance, wind, breath control, trigger squeeze, the cold mathematics of the shot, the patience required to wait. The difference between a possible shot and a necessary one. At 16, she hit a target at 900 meters in a stiff crosswind. He watched the impact through his spotting scope, paused, then said, "Fix your follow-through." She fixed it. His silence was his highest praise, a compliment she'd learned to read. Her acceptance to Johns Hopkins earned his quiet, unwavering support. He knew her hands were made for healing, a deep conviction he held, even while knowing he'd also taught them to break. A precious, complicated inheritance. In March of 2018, he composed a final letter, a directive he never mentioned. He sealed it and left it for when the time was right. He knew the score with his heart. The doctor's numbers were stark and clear, and he faced what they meant without fear. But he was a pragmatist, and that meant getting his final words down on paper. He passed on March 14th, 2019, in a San Diego hospital bed. He was 57. She was 21, a sophomore. The call came at 0600, and for an hour she sat in her dorm, feeling the tectonic shift as the architect of her world vanished. The ground beneath her gave way. Her entire internal framework had to be rebuilt from scratch. Then she rose, went to class, and executed the next task, just as he'd trained her. 2 weeks later, home after the funeral, she discovered the letter among his effects. She read it in her childhood room in Denton, Texas, as winter light streamed in. She went through it once, without pause, then folded it into an inside pocket. Where it stayed, that memory surfaced now as she stepped back inside the wire, heading to the aid station to prep her secondary trauma kits. She staged her primary gear at 3 defensible spots with multiple access routes. It was a solo job, after dark, completely off the books. No one saw her. It didn't matter. The next morning, 4 hours before step-off, she found Reed Kowalski. He was 23, buzzing with the energy of a young grunt before the first real fight. A tightly coiled spring, a body honed to its peak, unaware of the coming cost. He ran pre-combat checks south of the main structure, looking sharp, just like his morning medical report said, "Mission ready." For 90 seconds, she just watched. She saw the minute drag in his blink, a fractional effort no one else would catch. But catching tells was what she did. It was all she'd ever done. She watched his hands moving over his rifle. His grip was textbook, but the flow was off by a fraction of a second. She saw the slight delay as he turned his head when another Marine spoke to him. A sluggish reflex. She moved in. Kowalski. He looked up, his expression open and unworried. "Doc, hold fast a second." He complied. She took his pulse, her fingers on his wrist. She checked his pupils. Then she fired off 3 questions, timing his replies. "You have early-stage heat exhaustion," she stated flatly. "Started yesterday afternoon, based on these signs. Your core temp is up, pulse is off, you're getting IV fluids and rest. You're off the heavy gear roster for 3 hours. He started to object, just as she knew he would. "Doc, I'm good to go. Your reaction time is down 12%, she cut in, her voice level. "You can't feel it? Because from the inside, it feels normal. Tonight, that 12% gets someone killed. If this escalates on the objective, you become a liability." She let it sink in. "Commander Harwick will need to be briefed." Kowalski studied her, his mind recalibrating. "Roger that. Take a knee." Her IV kit was open in 20 seconds. Harwick strolled over, watching her work without a word. When she finished, her report was succinct. "He'll be full go in 3 hours with fluids. Light duty till 1400. Harwick gave a single, sharp nod and walked off. Briggs had been watching from 10 feet. He shifted his position closer, and for the next 30 minutes, his attention on her was entirely different. The mission brief began at 1300 hours in the main tent. It was standing room only. Harwick ran it with brutal economy. For him, planning and acting were the same fluid process. Tessa stood at the back, a notebook in hand, her focus so absolute it made her invisible. Those who see everything are rarely seen at all. A topo map glowed on the wall. Eastern Valley, 8 clicks out. A confirmed weapons cache in an occupied building. Ingress through the valley floor, with a secondary route along the North Ridge. 1 sniper assigned, Staff Sergeant Alrek, a proven shooter. 1 medic assigned, her. She scanned the map. As they discussed sniper hides, Harwick pointed to 2 positions. She analyzed the terrain. Without looking up from her notebook, she spoke. The outcropping at grid 477 puts our guys in the backblast area if he misses. The rock shelf at 479, 30 meters north, is a safer position and offers a cleaner shot. The tent went quiet. Harwick stared at the map, then at her. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "I'm reading the contour lines," she replied. He studied the map for 5 more seconds. Then he altered the plan, shifting the overwatch to her suggested spot. Briggs was standing 6 feet away. She didn't look, but she felt his focus shift, the subtle change of a man whose solid assumptions had just been cracked by a hard fact. She scribbled a note and fell silent. The hours before a mission have a unique gravity. The base grew quieter, movements more deliberate. Marines turned inward, preparing their minds for the violence to come. Rifles were cleaned with a focus born from harsh lessons. Gear was checked, then checked again. She ran through her medical pre-checks. Then she sat, hand on her chest, feeling the stiff fold of the letter through her uniform. For 5 years it had rested there, against her ribs, a constant presence. Her father had understood that critical moments don't wait for a convenient time to arrive. They hit you hard and fast. They come without warning, so the important things have to be said beforehand, when there is still time. He had said his piece in advance. She had read his words so many times, they were now the architecture of her own thoughts. They were no longer outside instructions, but an integrated part of her, less like a letter and more like bone. She pressed her palm to her chest. Outside, the air grew cold. Insertion was at 2100, 3 blacked-out helicopters slicing low through the mountains. Tessa sat in the second bird, watching the dark peaks skim past the open door. She kept her mind clear, a skill he had taught her that took years to perfect. The objective lay across 3 kilometers of open ground, up a funneling slope. The intel briefing called it a low-threat area. Drone feeds showed nothing. The cache was supposedly soft, but she knew the vast gap between supposed to be and is. She didn't doubt the data, she just knew all data is incomplete and trouble always hides in the gaps model. Thoughts kept private. Her job, the unexpected. 2 clicks out, helos gone. The valley watched. With the medics, conserving strength, Vance's eyes found her in the black. A sixth sense. His gaze broke. She scanned on autopilot. At 3.5 clicks, something was wrong. An optical shimmer on the rocks. Then again, a pattern, not random. She noted it. Then the night broke. An RPG. A pressure wave hit. Both ridges erupted in fire. A planned kill box. Survival was all. The unit scattered, training faster than thought. She was already at cover. Trauma kit open. First casualty found her. Kowalski was fading. Femoral hit. Tourniquet on, high and tight. She packed the wound. She spoke to him. Cold facts, not comfort. Clarity was the key. Look at my face. The third casualty came in. Tension pneumo. A 14-gauge needle, a hiss of air. Confirmed. Ridge machine guns pinned them. The nests were shielded from below. Harrick needed eyes on. Alrek's rifle was useless. She tracked the guns, finished with the wounded, looked at the ridge, then at Dunar. He knew. She set down her kit. The machine gun was a meat grinder, just deadly math. She pulled out the letter. Felt its weight. 5 years of carrying it. A final understanding. She put the letter back. Looked at Dunar. The M24, he knew where. She moved. The rifle felt like an extension of her. 10,000 reps. Below memory. She checked it. Not her preferred scope, but she would adapt. Dunar moved to spot. An unspoken language. She began the climb. A 35-degree slope. The darkness was her shield. She moved like a ghost. A learned quiet. The incoming fire was just weather. Rounds hit close. She adjusted her route. Dunar fed her data through the earpiece. This new angle defeated their cover. She had seen the geometry hours ago. She found her perch, went prone. The rifle settled into her shoulder, a perfect fit. She acquired the target. 2 men, sandbag nest, 780 meters out. She breathed. Her father had explained at age 10, In a Texas field at dawn, that distance shooting wasn't about power. It was about math, biology, and the discipline of turning your body into an instrument for a fraction of a second most people never experience. 5 years to be adequate, he'd said, 20 to be good. The difference between chance and true intent. He'd started her young. The wind mapped east-northeast, 12 miles per hour, confirmed from 2 points at 780 meters. A 12-mile-per-hour crosswind meant about 14 inches of drift for her round. She dialed the windage knob. She compensated for altitude, the cold, and the subtle Coriolis pull, minor at this range but never ignored. She controlled her breathing. 4 seconds in, hold. 8 seconds out. It was the rhythm that slowed the heart from combat tempo to the low 60s, where true precision was born. A process so ingrained since she was 12, it was as automatic as blinking. She found her natural aim, shifted 2 inches right for stability. A position maintained by muscle is a position that invites error, so she let the reticle settle on the first target. She felt for her heartbeat in her chest, wrist, her neck. She found the quiet space between each beat, the quarter second of stillness when the body's tremor is gone. That was her window. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle pushed back with a familiar, controlled recoil she'd felt 1,000 times. Holding through it, she brought the scope back on target. The shot was off, 8 inches to the right. The target was already scrambling for cover behind the sandbags. From the valley, she heard Briggs's voice, not the words, but the distinct tone of a man whose doubts had just been validated. It was irrelevant. The miss was all that mattered. She reran the numbers. The wind had gusts. She hadn't factored in the irregular spikes within the baseline. Through the scope, she watched the thermals, the way heat rising from the rock distorted the air in a repeating pattern. She timed it over 3 cycles, confirming a gust every 8 seconds. She clicked the windage 4 times to the left, rediscovered her breathing, her pulse, and the pause. She waited for the gust cycle to hit its low point, the 2-second lull of relative calm. She placed the crosshairs. She fired. The machine gun emplacement fell silent. Dunar's voice crackled in her ear, flat and emotionless. Target down. Guns cold. She was already moving. The second emplacement sat 140 meters south on the eastern ridge. A new angle, a new elevation. She moved 30 meters down the slope, finding the necessary line of sight, moving low and smooth. Rushing on a dark slope with a rifle is how you lose it all. She got into position, acquiring the target at 920 meters. It was across 2 ridges, shimmering with thermals and a wind shear she spotted by watching the grass on the valley floor for 40 seconds. 1 shot, 1 kill. She moved again. The entire process took 37 minutes and 6 different firing positions. The enemy positions fell one by one, the heaviest guns first, followed by support elements, then 2 light machine gun nests on the western ridge that were pinning down the withdrawal routes. She flowed between vantage points in the darkness, executing a plan already fully formed in her mind. She took the shot only when every variable was right. Every shot after the first miss was a clean first-round hit. Below, the battlefield transformed as she worked. Pinned down units started to advance as enemy fire evaporated. She heard Harwick redirecting squads through the lanes she was clearing. One part of her mind listening, the other solving the next problem. She wasn't thinking in the normal sense. Deliberation was a luxury for the planning stage. That had happened at the bottom of the slope, in the 2 seconds before she unslung the rifle. A decision was made. All that was left was the execution, which required no further thought. It required what her father had spent 6 years drilling into her: focused patience and the will to push through the hard part in the middle, the part where most people quit. She never quit. When the final gun went quiet, she held her position for 90 seconds, methodically scanning the ridge. Once satisfied, she keyed her mic. Commander Harwick, eastern and western ridge emplacements are down, corridors are clear. I advise extraction along the primary road. A beat of silence. Then Harwick's voice, strained with the effort of processing information that shattered his understanding of the situation. Copy that, Doc. What's your position? North slope, about 80 meters above the valley floor. I'm on my way down, a longer pause this time. Come down slow, he ordered. She descended the rock face with her rifle, and Dunar was there to meet her. Harwick stood 3 meters behind him, surrounded by a loose formation of men who just stared. She ignored their gazes. She walked to Alrek's gear, secured the rifle, then opened her trauma pack and knelt by the first casualty. Who else is hit? A particular kind of silence fell then, the kind that happens when a group of seasoned professionals witness something they simply cannot compute. It wasn't confusion. The men in the valley understood the chain of events on a technical level. The data was clear. Shots were fired, enemy guns went silent. Then she came off the slope, put away the rifle, and went back to being a medic without any sign that the last 37 minutes had even happened. Their silence was the sound of a worldview being forcibly recalibrated. Briggs stood on the edge of it for 4 minutes, then walked over to where she was treating a staff sergeant named Dow for a ricochet to the calf. He watched her work for another 2 minutes without speaking. His face held the expression of a man making a difficult and honest recalculation. Finally, he asked, "Where in the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" She didn't look up from the wound. "My father taught me." "Who was your father?" She gave him a fleeting glance. Then her focus returned to the injury. "A Navy man." Briggs looked at Dunar, who stood nearby, calm as a man holding a royal flush. Harwick joined Briggs, his face a mask of command, absorbing the new reality without letting it compromise his authority. He was managing it, but his eyes were locked on her, intently building a new file in his head. "Cole," he said. "Sir, when you're done here." 3 minutes, sir." He waited. She finished dressing Dow's wound, then stood to face the commander. He looked at her differently now. "Your father?" he began. "Frank Cole, retired Master Chief, SEAL Team 3. He served in Desert Storm, Somalia, and did 3 tours in Afghanistan." Harwick's gaze snapped to Dunar. "Frank Cole," Dunar confirmed, saying the name like an old, established fact. Briggs had already moved off, heading for a satellite link. He was about to pull Frank Cole's service record, and what he would find there was going to take him all night to process. The valley was settling into a new kind of quiet, not peace, but the heavy silence of an aftermath, the air itself seeming to hold the memory of the violence. She looked at Harwick. "I have 4 more casualties to assess before we can move out." "Do it," he said, and watched her walk away. An hour before dawn, with the wounded stable and the perimeter secure, Harwick found her. She was at the eastern edge of their position, her back to a rock, restocking her trauma kit with hands so practiced they seemed to move on their own. He chose a spot that offered conversation, not an interrogation. She was already waiting for his words. Somalia. Her hand stilled for a heartbeat. October 3rd and 4th, 1993. Her father spoke of it twice. Once at 14, when she pressed him. The other, at 20, discussing trauma physiology, when he shared a hard-earned lesson on sustained combat she needed for her medical work. She went back to her inventory. Few who were there ever speak of it. "No," Herrick agreed, "they don't." He glanced at the dark skyline. "He trained you personally. From 10 years old, 6 years of formal instruction, every weekend we could. Plus mornings and summers. Windage, distance, trigger squeeze. The cold math of it, the discipline." She snapped a case shut. "He was always my teacher. He ran out of new things to show me around 19. After that, we just maintained the skill. Then he was gone. And I made a commitment to my mother. She stated it plainly, a sequence of events, not a confession. She'd seen him off to war for 30 years. She asked me to let the weapon side of his life die with him. Not all of it, just the part that wasn't about healing. I gave my word. And tonight was about what the job demanded." She finally met his eyes. "My father taught me a promise is different from what that promise guards. A promise is just the architecture. What it protects is the reason you built it. When the structure and the reason diverge, you have to choose your true allegiance." Harwick watched her. "He sounds like a man I wish I'd known." "He was the finest man I ever knew," she said, not with warmth, but with the certainty of a fact proven by time. He remained silent a moment. Chief Dunar called Frank Cole a ghost, said it was the highest praise he knew. Vance Dunar doesn't waste words. He said the same about you. She offered no reply. Harit got to his feet. He paused before his final point. I'll require a complete debrief upon exfil. He specified, not the tactical breakdown of tonight. About you. How you ended up on this deployment, your full capabilities, and what I should have been aware of. This isn't disciplinary. It's command oversight. I need a full asset inventory. Understood, sir. He started to leave. Commander. He paused. Kowalski needs a surgical unit inside of 6 hours. My field patch is holding, but the clock is ticking. Already made the call. He gave her one last look. Get some rack time, Cole. She turned back to her kit, starting a second check. She didn't say that the kind of rest he meant wasn't an option for her. She just returned to the task, because the task was all there was, and it had to be enough. There was a letter. She'd first read it at 21, in a Baltimore dorm room. Winter sun streamed through the glass, and the normal sounds of a campus morning drifted in, completely alien to what she held. She found it among his effects 2 weeks after the service, the single envelope in his files bearing her name. She had sat in her childhood room, crushed by fresh grief, and opened it. He started with practicalities, being a practical man. Financial papers, his lawyer's contact, pension info, VA benefits. He was meticulous, and she had been thankful for it in the weeks after. Having clear instructions when your world has turned to dust is a profound gift. Then, he had written this. Tessa, I need to tell you something. I'd rather say face to face if I knew when my time was up. But time isn't so courteous, and I've learned that essential things must be said beforehand. In the moment itself, there is often no space to say them properly. He wrote, You gave your mother a promise, and I honor it. I was why she had to ask it of you. I know what she meant and why. Your mother possesses a wisdom that eludes us both. The kind gained from loving someone in a dangerous profession for 30 years and learning to bear its weight. He had written, but I must also say this. I am the man who taught you these skills. I did so because I felt it was vital for you to know, not to shape you in my image. I was adamant about that from the start. I taught you because true understanding, down to the roots, is the only way to carry a burden correctly. A person ignorant of something is its slave. A person who understands has a choice. He had written, I trust your judgment. I have since you were 12. You possess a quality I can't quite define in how you process information and reach a conclusion. It is rare. In 40 years of working with people under extreme pressure, I can count the times I've seen it on one hand. He had written, A time will come when you must choose between the promise and what you know to be right. I can't predict that moment, or what your choice should be. I can only say I trust you'll know the difference. And whatever you decide, I was proud of you long before that moment ever came. He signed it simply, Your Father. Not love, just the fact of his relation, which was perfect. She'd read that letter 40 times since finding it. She had every word memorized, but she kept the physical copy. It held something the memory couldn't. The paper's specific feel, the ink's varied pressure, the quiet reality of his hand moving on this very page, in a room she could still see. She had held it in her palm at the bottom of the ridge, just before taking up the rifle. Now she sat with her kit and the cold, letting the dawn arrive as it always does, making the night's events starkly, clinically clear. In the first light, she let herself consider the promise. She had broken it. There was no way to frame it otherwise. She had stood in her mother's Denton, Texas kitchen and made a vow, fully meaning to keep it. Tonight, she had not. Both facts were true. Both had to occupy the same space inside her. Her father had foreseen this. He had known a moment would come when the vow and the right action would diverge, and she would recognize it. She had. 60 operators would see this sunrise. Kowalski was 23. He'd go home after surgery and rehab, and live a life. The 40 operators in the kill zone who would have caught the mortar barrage if the enemy positions hadn't been silenced would see another day and the one after. She took that thought and stored it where she could manage it. Then she sat still and watched the valley emerge from the darkness. Briggs approached her an hour past sunrise. He came without preamble, sat on a nearby rock, and studied the peaks before he spoke. He didn't look at her. "Frank Cole," he said. "I reviewed his service record on the Satlink this morning." She waited. Desert Storm. 11 confirmed long-range kills in the Kuwait campaign, all by the book. Somalia. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 7 commendations, 4 of which were redacted at a clearance level above mine. He paused. The unclassified part of his file is a full career for most marksmen. I have to assume the sealed portion is just as substantial. She remained silent. "I said something when you arrived," he stated. "I remember. I wish to retract it. I know that's not possible." He finally looked at her. His expression changed. It was the look of a man making an honest self-assessment. "I made a call based on a single piece of intel. That isn't protecting my people. That's something else. A mistake I've made before and should know better than to make again." "You made a professional judgment with the intel you had," she replied. "You were doing your job. I was doing it poorly," he countered. "Bad process, bad call." She let his words hang in the air. "Acknowledge it," she said. "Then file it where it can be of use." "That's what my father would have said." He looked at her. Did he often speak so directly? He was the kind of man who said something like that one time and expected it to stick. She paused. He would have spent hours analyzing exactly what went wrong tonight and what could be improved, and then he would have deemed the outcome acceptable. That was the highest praise he ever gave. Briggs absorbed that for a moment. Then he got up. His bearing had shifted, a fundamental realignment that ran deeper than posture. "For the record," he said, "what you did on that ridge was masterful, by any measure I know." He turned and walked away. She watched him leave. Exfil was at 0900. She rode the bird with hands on 2 casualties, her voice steady and clinical, guiding men through the wreckage their bodies had become. Kowalski was conscious, his eyes meeting hers in silence, which was exactly right. The FOB materialized from the dust and they touched down. She went straight from the pad to the aid station to transfer the patients, detailing every field treatment and decision made under fire. A clean handoff was life or death. Men who won the firefight could still lose the war on an operating table. It took 2 hours. Harwick was outside the tent when she emerged, standing with the stillness of a man whose shock had worn off, leaving only hard questions. They found a seat on a couple of supply crates. "Walk me through it," he said. "How'd you get this post?" The original corpsman, Lieutenant Marsh, got a hot appendix 4 days ago. The billet went to the contractor list. I put my name in. Why? She knew this was coming. I saw the mission specs before I applied. The profile listed a single designated marksman. I pulled Staff Sergeant Alrich's file. Solid operator, good history, but this AO is too big for one set of eyes. The job was for a medic. She met his gaze. I was qualified for both, so I took the slot. Harwick stared at her. "You got on that chopper knowing you had skills that weren't on the manifest." "I knew it was a possibility. I didn't know it was a certainty." "You never mentioned it. Everything official is in my record. My tactical skills aren't. My father taught me for my own sake, not for a military designation. It's not in any document NavSpecWar has on file." Her eyes never left his. "If I'd listed it, this would have gone through different channels. Getting another shooter approved takes time. I had 4 days. The system would have just found a body, not someone who'd already analyzed the op and knew exactly what gap needed plugging." He was silent. "You came here knowing," he said, the words coming slow, "and you put yourself in a position to be the solution without ever saying a word." "Yes. Why the secrecy? If I'd shown up as a shooter with a medic cert, we'd have spent the whole deployment arguing about credentials I can't prove on paper. My whole tour would have been spent defending my billet instead of executing my duties." She paused. The mission trumped the politics. He stood, paced 4 steps away, presenting his back to her briefly before turning. "Tonight's AAR goes in raw," he stated. "The whole damn thing. That report will climb the chain, and I can't predict the fallout. You need to grasp that. I do. This could get messy for you, sir. 3 Kia, 22 wounded, objective compromised. The situation is already FUBAR. What I did down there either gets logged accurately or it doesn't, and a lie only protects me, which isn't the mission." He watched her, a long, assessing look. "Write it accurately," she repeated. He gave a single nod and walked toward the command tent. She sat, watching the mountains in the sharp morning light, clean, hard, and definite, like the world, after a long night, has stripped things away. Her hand went to her chest. "I broke a promise, and it was right." He knew. I think I always knew, too. She stood and went back to the tent to finish her paperwork. The intel file on Owen Graff dropped via Satlink at 1300 hours the next day. Harwick read it twice, then called his team leads. It wasn't thick. The important files never are. Graff was born in 1973, Knoxville, Tennessee. Enlisted at 18, moved through the pipeline that finds certain men for certain jobs. He passed the Delta selection course. The agency's Special Activities Division picked him up in his early 30s, the unit that works in the gray spaces, doing the jobs governments need done but won't acknowledge. By all accounts, he was a natural. His file painted a picture of a tactical prodigy with a moral gravity that separated him from the operators who just followed orders. Graff always thought about the weight of it. The file called this an asset until it became a liability. In 2012, he took a four-man team into Syria, Operation Cardinal. They completed the mission, but their exfil was blown. They popped smoke and called for evac. The bird was inbound. Then, 40 minutes out, it was waved off. Official reason: bad weather. Weathersats from two separate stations showed clear skies. 3 of Graff's men died in the firefight that followed. Graff was taken alive. He endured 18 months of conditions the body isn't meant for. He got out through a chain of events the file described with deliberate vagueness. He was declared KIA in December 2012. He wasn't. For 12 years, he'd been alive and building. What he'd built was now dug into the mountains surrounding them, with a plan and resources that weren't born of madness. This was the work of a man who'd had a decade to think about one problem: how to make men answer for the things they do in the dark. Harwick set the file down. He's not a fanatic, Harwick stated. He's not trying to burn the world down. He wants one thing: to drag a specific set of decisions into the light to be judged. He let that sink in. That doesn't excuse his actions. It just makes him more dangerous than a zealot, because a man with a clear, rational goal is methodical. The reality of it settled in the room. "He'll hit us again tonight," Harwick said. No one questioned it. The logic was obvious. A man doesn't spend 12 years on a plan just to quit after one setback. Tessa was at the edge of the room, silent. She'd read the file over his shoulder, and he'd let her. She'd read it once, and the facts had settled inside her, rearranging her understanding of the fight they were in. She thought of a man in Syria in 2012, calling for a rescue that was almost there, and the silence that followed when everything changed. She thought of what a man becomes after 18 months of that hell, how it fractures his faith in institutions, in the very idea of being on a side. She pictured the unique poison of a betrayal by your own people and how it festers over the years. She kept these thoughts to herself and returned to the aid station. She spent the next 4 hours prepping. She refilled trauma bags and moved her aid caches to new spots, anticipating the attack lanes a smart enemy would use after learning from his first attempt. She re-examined every casualty report, knowing stabilization in the field was just a pause button. After, she ate a hot meal, deliberately. Her father had drilled into her that food and sleep were weapons, not comforts. He was right about that. Like most things, she got 90 minutes of deep, combat-level rest, the kind you learn to steal when you can. Back in the medical tent, she double-checked her work. Dunar appeared in the doorway at 1700. He just stood there, and they shared a look of easy understanding, the kind forged between two people who've seen too much, too fast, to need words. "Tonight's going to be a tougher fight," he stated. "I get it. Last night, you had the element of surprise. Now, Graff knows your playbook. He'll be ready for you," she acknowledged with a nod. "How are the hands?" She inspected them, front and back, noting a minor blister from the previous engagement. She filed it away as simple operational data. "They're fine," she replied. He fell into that specific silence Vance Dunar used right. before he dropped something heavy. "Your father sent me a message," he said. "January 2019, 2 months before he passed." She went completely still. "He wanted to tell me about something you were working on, something that made him proud. He wasn't a man for emails, you know. So I knew this had to be important to him, to get it down in writing." Dunar stared at the tense fabric wall, as if the words were written there. "He said you'd started advising a naval special warfare program on your own time, completely off the books." He paused. "He wrote that you'd engineered a new system for integrated battlefield medicine that he considered the most significant advance in Spec Ops training he'd seen in 20 years. His exact words? She focused on the supply crate before her. He said you stayed anonymous so your rank wouldn't get in the way of the learning. He said it was the right call, that it was pure you." She latched the case shut. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew." A silence fell between them. Afternoon sun filtered through the canvas, casting geometric shapes on the gear. Outside, the wind whipped across the firebase. Dunar broke the quiet. "Let me tell you why I held on to this. When you got here, I knew who you were, but I didn't have the whole story. I knew Frank's daughter was doing big things in the training world. I just didn't grasp the scale of it. I had no idea you were the voice." He looked her square in the eye. "And I figured if I brought it up too soon, it might compromise how you handled this. Frank trusted you to do the work without needing a medal for it. I figured I owed him and you that same respect." She studied him for a long beat. "He was always playing three-dimensional chess," she said quietly. "Yes, he was. You've known since I stepped off that chopper. I had a strong hunch. It was confirmed in the briefing, hearing you describe the Overwatch. That whole methodology has a unique signature. I recognized it." He paused. "He taught you the book, and then you wrote a whole new volume he never even imagined." She didn't reply at first. She'd spent 3 years building that system in the cracks, between official medical duties in the space between her job description and what she knew had to be done. She hadn't created some official program with a cover sheet and a chain of command. It was a philosophy forged from first principles, designed to patch a critical hole she saw in how operators linked medical action to tactical command decisions on the battlefield. She'd taught it all through an anonymous voice protocol, no face, no rank, nothing that could be traced back to her. The operators who trained under it just called the instructor the mentor. She never claimed the name, but she never denied it either. She just did the job. "Tonight," she finally said. "Tonight," Dunar echoed. He ducked out of the tent, leaving her alone in the fading light for another minute. Then she went to go find Harwick. At 2200 hours, Graf came for them. He struck from underground, from the south, using a network of drainage channels that snaked beneath the valley, a maze of tunnels and rock fissures the initial base survey had flagged as impassable. The survey was right about most of it, but not all of it. 200 men boiled out of the ground from 4 points on the southern perimeter at the exact same time. They moved like a single organism, a unit drilled specifically for this kind of assault. This wasn't round 2 of the same failed attack. This was a completely new strategy, born from the same cunning mind. It was a plan that showed he dissected exactly why his first attempt had fallen apart. The perimeter held for the first 4 minutes. Harwick had seen the southern approach coming and had stacked his defenses accordingly. The storm of disciplined, concentrated fire that met Graf's men shattered their first wave. Then the second wave crashed in, and then the third. The relentless, synchronized pressure from 3 points at once squeezed their defensive bubble, causing it to collapse faster than any contingency plan had allowed for. It's the classic way a defense breaks when the enemy has studied your last move and countered it perfectly. Tessa was in the med tent when the first rounds cracked overhead. 45 seconds later, she was at the eastern line, moving in a low combat shuffle that kept her head below the streams of tracer fire, medkit in one hand, her M24 slung over her shoulder. The two roles felt like one now. The contradiction had burned away sometime in the last 18 hours. A 12-man element, run by Briggs, was holding the eastern flank. She got to them and instantly triaged the worst casualty. A corporal named Holloway with an in-and-out wound to his right thigh that no one had touched yet. She started working on him, her eyes constantly scanning the team's defensive position. The heaviest fire was coming from an elevated position 200 meters to the southeast, giving Graf's men a perfect line of sight onto their entire perimeter. Briggs had 2 Marines trying to suppress it, but their angle was bad. They were just keeping the enemy's heads down, not taking them out of the fight, a critical difference that was getting them chewed up. She finished packing Holloway's wound and cinched the tourniquet. Briggs, that nest at 210, your angle is no good. He shot her a look but didn't waste time arguing. 400 meters, movers, 2 positions. The left one is exposed at the top of his cycle. She was already moving, scrambling to a spot that gave her a better shot. Give me 60 seconds. She went prone behind a supply crate, finding the nest in her scope. She dialed in for the dark, the distance, and the wind, which was different here than down on the flat ground. The target had a rhythm. 3 seconds exposed, 4 seconds in cover. She watched him for 3 cycles to confirm the pattern, and on the 4th, she squeezed the trigger. The left position vanished. She low-crawled 40 meters north along the wall to get a clean angle on the second shooter, who had shifted after his partner went silent. She got flat, acquired the target, and fired. The high ground went quiet. In 30 seconds, she was back with Holloway, checking the pressure. She tightened the tourniquet just as Briggs was fully processing what she'd done. He stared at her, but there were no words for it, so he said nothing. She was already on her way to the next wounded Marine. At 22:40, Kowalski collapsed. He'd been cleared for light duty and put on a secondary line, but that line had become the front as the perimeter shrank. He'd been holding his own, doing his job, and then he just dropped, the way a man does when his body finally gives out. She'd been keeping a subtle watch on his breathing all afternoon, a habit with all her post-op patients. His oxygen saturation levels at 1600 had been on the low side of normal. He'd been breathing shallowly, which she'd chalked up to managing his pain. That was a mistake, a bad call she'd been quietly reevaluating for hours. When she heard the distinct change in his respiration at 22:40, she knew instantly what it was. He was at his side in 6 seconds. The tension pneumothorax had been building slowly, aggravated by the altitude changes during the medevac and pushed over the edge by the stress of the firefight. His trachea was deviating, no breath sounds on the left. Full-blown respiratory crisis. "Kowalski, look at me!" He couldn't answer. His skin had that awful gray tint of a man losing oxygen faster than his brain can register. She ripped out a 14-gauge needle, found the spot by feel in the dark second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and drove it home with committed force. You can't hesitate on a needle decompression. Hesitation means failure. The immediate hiss of air, the visible relief washing over his face as his chest began to rise and fall properly. She kept a hand on his sternum, counting his breaths, watching the color flood back into his cheeks, talking to him in a calm, clinical tone. Needles in, your lungs reinflating. Slow breaths, slower than you want to. Good. He obeyed. Her hand remained on his chest, feeling his system reboot while the other half of her mind tracked the symphony of the firefight. She was running both programs in parallel, just as she'd been doing since she accepted she would always be 2 things at once. Then she heard the shift. The tone of the incoming fire from the west changed its tune. Someone had moved, found a new angle, a new line of attack that wasn't there 30 seconds ago. She tore her eyes away from Kowalski and saw Harwick 70 meters away, pinned down at the edge of a supply container, completely exposed. Repositioning his men was the right call, but it left him exposed. Leadership demanded presence, and presence meant risk. The approach had been clear moments ago, now it wasn't. A hostile, 240 meters out, had a clean line of sight and was taking the shot. 3 seconds. She let go of Kowalski, ordering the Marine next to him, keep him down, hands on his chest. She moved, not to Harwick, but 8 meters to a supply case. It gave her the angle, no time to go prone. She took a knee, rifle up, scope finding its mark in the gloom. No time for breath control or to steady her pulse. She found the target in the reticle and squeezed the trigger. 240 meters vanished in a heartbeat. Harwick spun at the sound, looked at the enemy position, then back at her, She was already moving back to Kowalski. Her hand returned to his chest, checking the seal, ensuring the lung held, resuming the assessment. Her father had mentioned this once, a November morning at the range when she was 20. She'd asked how he squared his profession with the man he was off duty. He was silent for a while. Then, there's no squaring it, no separation, just your hands. They know their job. What they do is who you are. The skill isn't in one hand or the other. It's knowing when to use each and having the will to do it. Both hands. She monitored Kowalski's pulse with one hand, scanning the wire with the other. She understood then, on a level deeper than words, that she'd become what he was aiming for, not what he was. He was clear on that. Aim for the ideal, not the man. Owen Graff ordered the retreat at 23:14. Outside the wire, no one knew the real reason why. The after-action report would dissect tactical failures, losing the high ground, failed assaults, the defender's disciplined response. Those were all factors, and they mattered. But the grunts who were there, they told a different story. They said the attack broke when the enemy's pressure changed, when a hesitation rippled through their ranks, a feeling of facing something they couldn't define. What they felt was a base not on its last legs. Every push was met with a measured, not a panicked, response. Every breach that should have opened was sealed before it could be exploited. The defense had an intelligence to it Graff hadn't anticipated, and his men felt it in their gut. The base held an ace he hadn't planned for. They melted back into the mountains. Harwick had birds in the air within 4 minutes. The base was evacuated in 17. She was on the third chopper, hands on 2 casualties, monitoring and reassuring both with a steady voice that cut through the fear. The mountains fell away into darkness. She focused on the vitals, nothing else. That was enough. Graff was captured 3 days later. Harwick was there when they brought him in, a request granted without question. He faced a man of 51 who moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 12 years surviving harsh places. Graff's hands were still, his face a mask. He met Harwick's gaze, unafraid, like a man ready for a final reckoning. Harwick waited a long time before speaking. Syria, 2012. Graff replied, "Yes, what happened to your team?" "You know what happened. I want to hear it from you." Graff held his gaze, then spoke for 40 minutes, his voice the flat tone of a debrief. The room was silent when he finished. When Harwick stood, he offered no official apology. He couldn't, and it wouldn't have been enough. But he said one thing before leaving. "This should have been in the record 12 years ago. I'll make sure it gets there now." Something in Graff's expression shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, but the look of a man whose burden was finally acknowledged by someone who planned to act. "That's enough," Graff said. Harwick's after-action report was 47 pages. He mentioned it to her in passing, just another fact. He had detailed her capabilities, all of them. He noted the 22 field medical interventions and the tactical decisions linking them. His assessment was direct. He also reported her non-disclosure, adding that her choice produced an outcome the standard process would have prevented. He told her of his recommendation 4 days later in the debriefing room. "A rear admiral wants to speak with you," Harwick said. "Name's Caldwell, Thomas Caldwell. He's been heading an integrated training program at NavSpec Warcom for 4 years. He greenlit an anonymous coaching experiment 3 years ago," Harwick said, a trace of humor in his tone. "He did it without knowing who was behind it." She remained impassive. "He wants a conversation, not an assignment." To discuss the curriculum and its potential with full support, Harwick looked at her. "He says knowing now who you are, he'd have approved it faster." She considered the implications of scale, of 4,000 individuals, of what happened when a method went from an anonymous protocol to an institutional program. She weighed the purity of the quiet approach against the reach of an official one. "I'll talk to him," she said. Harwick nodded. Before leaving, he added, "My son is 22. He's in BUDS. I think about the training he's getting, and I see the gaps between medical and tactical training, and how we teach it." He paused. "What you built. He's going to need it. They all need it." He stood. "I'm glad you came. It was Dunar who told everyone else." On the fifth evening, the main common area was packed with several hundred Marines. The rest crowded the hallway, waiting for words to travel. Tessa wasn't present. She was in the med bay, finishing paperwork. Dunar stood and told them about Frank Cole. Not his life story, but the core of the man he was. What he'd built in 30 years of service, what he understood about the job, and about the person he was leaving behind. He spoke of a daughter who'd gained something not passed through blood, but through countless early mornings and the focused love a man has for his life's work. He told them of a promise made on a dark night in a valley. Then he told them about the mentor, using the same blunt language they all spoke. The anonymous voice from their 3-year training protocol, the guide through scenarios that had just become terrifyingly real, was the same contractor who'd been on their base. The voice on the radio that second night, calm and precise, directing units through the chaos from behind a rock with a bullet in her shoulder, had been hers. The squad bay fell into a heavy silence, the kind that settles in your bones before your brain can process the words just spoken. Lance Corporal Reed Kowalski sat bolt upright in the third row. He'd heard that voice on the training sims 42 times in 3 years. He'd never seen the face that went with it, never bothered to ask. The protocol said the instructor's identity was irrelevant, and he trusted the protocol because it worked. Now, listening to Dunar, he replayed those 42 sessions, cataloging the subtle shifts in his own instincts on the battlefield. A flash of memory, a valley floor, a tourniquet applied in 90 seconds flat, the prick of a needle in total darkness, a steady hand on his chest. Breathe, Marine. He got to his feet. No words, just the sharp movement. The Marine next to him rose, then the one behind. The impulse spread, a silent, unified current between men forged in the same fire. It wasn't an order, wasn't organized. It was muscle memory, a shared understanding deeper than thought. In the passageway, Marines who'd only heard the words were standing too. He found her in the battalion aid station, where she was finishing up paperwork. He'd been walking unassisted for 2 days now, the tension pneumothorax finally resolving, moving slow, but moving. He sat opposite her at the small table. Their eyes met. "I know your voice," he stated, his own voice rough. She offered no immediate confirmation. "The third session," he continued, 2 years ago, that Maskell sim with the IED and the building collapse. You said, don't triage for speed, triage for outcome. The guy needing the most work isn't always your priority. Work for the best overall result, not the best single save." He let that hang in the air. I've run that through my head maybe 400 times since. It changed my entire approach to tactical priority. She set her pen down. "Yes," she said. He gave a sharp nod. "Why the Ghost Act?" Her consideration was brief but intense. If I'd attached a name and a face to the lessons, the first fight would have been about my credentials. Whether some civilian contractor had any business teaching seasoned operators how to think under fire, she leveled her gaze at him. That debate's about me, not the material. The material is what saves lives. The instruction needed to be judged on its own merit. He processed that. 314 sessions over 3 years. An average of 14 operators per class, he calculated aloud. That's over 4,000 Marines who learned from you. He paused. Including us. Including what happened out there. She picked up her pen again. "You need to rest, Kowalski. Your lung isn't a suggestion." "I know." He stood. He held her gaze, his expression one of a man whose foundations had been permanently shifted. "At the hatch," he said, "Doc." She looked up. He gave a single, definitive nod. She returned it. The shoulder operation took 2 hours. The repair was clean. The prognosis for a full return to duty, excellent. She surfaced from the anesthesia with the wired alertness of someone whose system was on standby, snapping back online the second the drugs wore off. Harwick was in the chair by the bed. "Surgery was a success," he said, looking up from his datapad. "I spoke with the surgeon before." He set the device aside. "Caldwell called while you were under. He's been the driving force on this integrated training program for 4 years. He's the one who greenlit the anonymous protocol." Harwick met her eyes. "He said if he'd known it was you, he'd have approved it faster and with a bigger budget. So what's the ask?" she said. He wants to build out the curriculum, formalize it with institutional backing, real funding, and the ability to scale it across multiple commands. He's not asking you to enlist, he's proposing something unprecedented, wants to talk it over. She stared at the ceiling tiles, her mind crunching the numbers. What did 4,000 operators become when the protocol became doctrine? She thought of Kowalski's simple math and what it meant, boots on the ground, armed with a better way to think, a better way to survive. Was the anonymous advantage worth more than institutional reach? Was there even one right answer to that? "I'll take the meeting," she said. Harwick nodded. A moment passed. "My report is filed," he added. "It's accurate. All of it. What you did out there is in the official record. It's permanent." She looked at him, her jaw set. Good. Briggs showed up the next morning, early, during that quiet window, before the base truly roared to life. He moved like a man executing a mission before second thoughts could creep in. He sat by her bed. He studied his own hands for a second. When you hit the LZ, he started, "I said something." "Colt, you don't have to. Let me finish." She fell silent. "I made a call in under 30 seconds based on one look. I said it out loud. I repeated it, and I was wrong on every conceivable level." He finally looked up at her. "I know you said I was protecting my guys. I was. But I was also letting a first impression harden into a fact. That's not protecting anyone. That's a personal bias I should have outgrown by now." A pause. "I am sorry." She held his gaze. "Accepted," she said. He gave a short, relieved nod. "Good. Then I want in the first cohort." She cocked an eyebrow. "Cohort? Whatever Caldwell's spinning up. The formal program. I want to be student number 1. He met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm 41 years old, 12 years in the teams, and I've always seen TAC and Med as two different worlds. I was wrong for 12 years. I want a seat in that first class." She considered him for a long, silent moment. "I'll add your name to the list," Percy said finally. He stood. "Your old man," he said, his voice low. "Whatever else he was, he built the right thing in you." And then he was gone. 6 months on, the dark circles under her eyes were gone. She'd regained the 9 pounds lost to the deployment, the surgery, and the slow grind of recovery. It happened not by force, but as a natural result of regular meals, proper sleep, and a body no longer on a war footing. Her left shoulder still talked to her when the weather turned cold, a low, persistent ache in the repaired joint that the surgeon warned might be a permanent souvenir. She filed it under data, not problem. Just feedback from the equipment. She ran at 0530 every morning, 6 miles along the bay with the Pacific to her left. The pre-dawn salt air was a cold, clean shock to the system. Her father had always said that routine was not the cage, it was the frame. Routine was the structure that kept you standing when the world tried to knock you down. After her run and a quick meal, she'd walk to the classroom building assigned to the new Integrated Combat Medicine program. The first cohort had just graduated. The second was 2 weeks in. The first class had 16 students. The second had 22. The waitlist for the third was already at 47 names. She paused at the classroom door, scanning the 22 faces inside. They ranged in age from 22 to 44, with centuries of combined operational experience between them. They were here because High Command had finally seen the value and because the word had spread through the community. It traveled through the back channels, from men who'd been to the dark places to those heading there. The scuttlebutt was simple. There's a course. It teaches you something you don't know you need, until it's the only thing you need. Go. Reed Kowalski was in the back, fully recovered and cleared for duty. He'd put in for the second cohort the day the list opened. He'd earned his spot, no favoritism given. His eyes met hers as she entered, and he gave a slight nod. She nodded back. Colt Briggs sat in the third row. He was squared away, his attention locked forward, the posture of a man who had come to learn, not to judge. She held herself like someone who had dismantled a core belief and was now building something new from the wreckage. At the squad bay's front, 11 words she'd scrawled on the whiteboard the night before hung in the silence, a testament to her father, the valley, and the crucial question of what truly endures. She hadn't used a printer or a laminator, She'd written them in permanent ink. They remained between training cycles, not as a curriculum point, but as the foundational creed, the steel frame upon which everything else was constructed. Heal when you can, fight when you must, know the difference. Her eyes swept the room. 22 souls, all from different walks, all here for their own reasons. Their common ground was this: they'd all operated in places where that distinction was absolute, and they were here to master it. She rang her mom on a Tuesday night in November, the window of her BOQ open to the steady push of the Pacific, a sound that had been her lullaby for 6 months. Her mother, 63, was still in the Denton, Texas house where Tessa grew up, where her father, Frank, had cultivated a garden with his trademark precision. Her mom took over the garden after he was gone, calling it the strangest part of her grief. Continuing his labor was how she kept a piece of him alive in the world. They spoke for 40 minutes. When asked about her shoulder, she said it was solid, which was the truth. When asked about the grunts, Tessa detailed the second cohort, their diverse field experience, their sharp focus, the unique pride in seeing a concept take root in men who would carry it into the suck to places she'd never see. A brief silence hung on the line. Then her mother said, "I was terrified when I learned what happened over there. Terrified, then furious, then just terrified all over again. I know, and then I considered what your father would say. And he would say you knew the mission. A beat. He would say you were right where you were supposed to be. He'd say, I told her she'd know the difference. He did tell me that," Tessa murmured. "I know, honey. He told me he had." Her mother's voice was like a heavy ruck being carefully set down, not abandoned, just eased. He was always 3 moves ahead, even of this. "Yes. Are you okay with it?" Tessa gazed out the open window, the ocean's rhythm a dark constant. "I think I am," she replied. "I think I have been for a while, just hadn't said it." "Good," her mother affirmed. "That's all that matters." That night, she pulled the letter from her jacket's inner pocket, where it had rested against her ribs for 5 years and 3 months. She sat at her desk, holding the sealed envelope. The words inside were already part of her, absorbed long ago, less like external orders and more like a piece of her own internal structure, part of her very framework. She held it. She recalled his words about a promise versus what the promise protected, about the hard calls an operator with integrity has to make, about trusting your gut when everything goes sideways. She had trusted her gut. It had been the right call. She opened her desk drawer, laid the letter flat in the center, and shut it. Not gone, not discarded, just at ease. She no longer needed to carry it. Its contents were already forged into the architecture of her instincts and actions. She'd been reading it for 5 years. Its purpose was fulfilled, the work now internalized. She was the message now. Monday morning, 0800. She stood before them, Coronado light flooding the classroom, 22 Marines facing her. Behind her, the 11 words stood stark. Words she'd written, words she meant down to the letter. A brief from Cowell's office the night before confirmed it. 3rd cohort applications were double the projections. 2 other commands were looking to adopt the program. The Senate's classified Syria hearings now had a record, meaning what happened in the dark was now in the light. She considered this for a moment, then field-stripped the thoughts. She locked eyes with Kowalski in the back, notebook open, pen poised, watching with the intensity of a man who knows the real-world cost of these lessons. Her gaze found Briggs in the 3rd row, sitting ramrod straight, a man who in 2 weeks had proven that a genuine decision to learn can forge rapid, meaningful change. She pictured her father on his 6-mile run at 0530 in San Diego. She thought of a man who knew the most critical work leaves no paper trail, no medals, no official record. He understood that the only thing that lasts is the understanding you build in others, the ethos that keeps moving long after you've left the room. Not the rounds you fire, but the clarity you leave behind. She remembered a dark valley, a letter in her palm, and a choice made in the 2 seconds before acting on a promise she was forced to break. She thought of 63 dead and 477 men who saw another sunrise because of the brutal math she'd been forced to do. She thought of her mother's voice, of the letter finally at rest in its drawer after 5 years. She thought of what it means to walk through hell and still be standing. She looked at the 22 men who would see their own hard places again, here to learn how to carry a different burden on the way back. She took a deep breath. "All right," she said. "Let's get to work." And they did.